From Erfurt University.
I think so, yes.
Yes, I guess. Yeah, well, Asaph is a specialist, a scholar of early modern Oriental studies, 17th century, early 18th century, mainly in the Lutheran area, I think I can say that. And he has been and still is a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter at the Max Weber College in Erfurt. And he is now, in January, starting as a researcher in our HERA project. He will study the work and the legacy, the archive of Johann
Ernst Gerhard.
Johann Ernst Gerhard, sorry. Not one of the greatest, most famous Oriental scholars, but a very typical Oriental scholar who wrote a harmonic language of Oriental languages. But today you will speak about Johann Heinrich Zechendorff.
You're just Johann Zechendorff.
Johann Zechendorff, sorry. And he's Arabic teaching in Zwickau.
If I may, thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. Yes, I'd like to insidiously draw your attention from this illustrious, from here in Leiden, from this illustrious center of the Republic of Letters and of Arabic Studies, to a less, if you will, to a rather humble province of this republic, or perhaps to put it in nicer terms, to an interesting suburb of the Republic of Letters. This will be about Johann Zechendorff. Oh, thank you. Is the PowerPoint? Sorry. Yes, I'll start. So it's Johann Zechendorff and Arabic Studies at Zwickau's Latin School. There you have the, looks a bit like an obituary, but Zwickau in electoral Saxony was not a good place to be during the 30 Years' War. No, it's true. Throughout the 1620s and 30s, the town's inhabitants were repeatedly subjected to the miseries of chronic warfare. Worse yet were the accompanying inflictions, hunger, and repeated outbreaks of the plague. The town's Latin school was spared none of these miseries. During one bubonic outbreak, probably 1633 or 36, I can't be certain, Johann Zechendorff, headmaster of Zwickau's Latin School, decided to take action. God, in his wrath, was chastising the town with the scourge of war, hunger, and pestilence. Zechendorff wrote in the introduction to a strange and undated work extant only in manuscript in Zwickau's Ratsschulbibliothek. To assuage this divine displeasure, Zechendorff decided temporarily to suspend the study of profane authors, the Greek and Roman authors, and instead dedicate his pedagogical efforts to reading and commentating the 7 penitential psalms with his pupils. These he read with his pupils in the classroom as well as in private lessons. Zechendorff, throughout his very long career, like a university professor, in fact, offered public lectures as well as privata, so as his privata collegia, which is typical of school teachers in his day. So this he read with his pupils in classroom as well as privately in no less than 30 versions in translations and paraphrases. Since some of his pupils had begun learning Arabic, Zechendorff undertook the compilation of a Quranic paraphrase, not a translation, a Quranic paraphrase of the 7 penitential psalms to better acquaint them, his pupils, with the Quran's vocabulary and phraseology. And here we have this. Yes. Muhammad, for Zechendorff, the unquestionable author of the Quran, whom he dubbed the Arab Cicero, the Cicero Arabicus, according to him, a common epithet for Muhammad among Muslims. That's debatable, but Zechendorff seems convinced. This resulted in a curious work, which Zechendorff never got printed, with the equally curious title, which you can see here, an Arabic paraphrase of the 7 penitential psalms, that is, in the style and taken from the system of the Quran, which contains 113 chapters. This is a slip, of course, but I wouldn't read too much into it. Zechendorff actually translated in his correspondence the 114th surah, so I think this is just a slip, or rather from the Arab Cicero and in the Ishmaelitic and regal Solomonic language, in pure and unadulterated speech set down rhythmically with an interlinear Latin translation for the benefit of German students of Arabic to enable them access to the Quran. Thus far, the title. In the lengthy German introduction, Zechendorff argues that there is more eloquence, Reden und Wort, and substance, res oder realia, in the Psalter than in the monotone droning of that deluded Muhammad. This, however, stands in contrast to his following assurance that the paraphrase, using Quranic verses as mosaic stones, as it were, is, I quote, magnificently beautiful and ornate, set and recited in the regal Arabic tongue, as it, Arabic, is attributed to King Solomon as its inventor, through the wisdom with which he was endowed by God. So, for the sake of this language, it is not to be contemned. And here we have the first page of Psalm 6, beg your pardon. Each psalm verse appears at the bottom of the page in Luther's translation. Here you have, Herr Gott, straf mich nicht in deinem Zorn. Along the line, several Quranic verses, or rather pseudo-Quranic verses, which approximate the content and tenor of each verse. To this is added an interlinear Latin translation. The ostensible point of this exercise was a mixture of Lutheran piety in the face of horrible adversity and an attempt to help his pupils better understand the Quran's difficult language. Though a detailed introduction and the manuscript's careful layout suggests it may have been meant for publication, the work was never printed, nor am I acquainted with any contemporary or indeed later references to this work. More curious, however, than the work itself is the fact that Arabic instruction was at all offered in Zwickau in the 1630s, and that its headmaster was concerned to help Saxon school children better understand the Quran in Arabic. This raises several questions, only some of which I can attempt to answer, and probably none of which I can actually answer properly, but I'll try. This curious work is an appropriate starting point for a consideration of Johann Zechendorff and Arabic studies at Zwickau's Latin School, which he ran as headmaster from 1617 to his death in 1662 at the age of 82. It's a very long tenure. Appropriate first and foremost as it's Zechendorff's fascination with the Quran, which has earned him occasional, though fleeting, appearances in modern scholarship, especially two slim editions of short Quranic chapters accompanied by an interlinear Latin translation and comments. These two works, the Specimen Suratarum of 1638 and the undated Suratai Unius ad Quaternius Textus, probably of the early 1640s, are among the first early modern attempts at translating and annotating portions of the Quran, editing in Arabic and offering annotations and translation. Better known, of course, is Thomas Serpenius's Arab and Latin edition of the 12th Surah, the story of Joseph, and of course Surah Al-Turabun, Surah 64, the deceit of 1620. This has, that's Zechendorff's exertions, has since the late 17th century awarded Zechendorff a stable, though tiny, niche in accounts of Arabic studies. To this should be added a typographical peculiarity. Arabic types were a rare commodity in the 17th century, and the printers with whom Zechendorff collaborated, mostly in Zwickau, had none, which comes as no surprise. His Arabic works either appear, the little he published, either appear in Hebrew transliteration, which is a common practice, well into the 18th century, or in the case of his Quran specimen, with self-made Arabic types, for whose crudity Zechendorff apologized profusely in his correspondence, and here we have one specimen. This is the elegant, fairly standard title page. This is the Specimen Surtam of 1638. One of the tantalizing things about Zechendorff, both his printed works and his fairly extensive Nachlass, is that he very rarely dates his works. So we usually need his correspondence with contemporary scholars. So this is a fairly standard title page, and here you have his own kind of potato stamp, the wooden types, which he... And yet, though Zechendorff was to become known for his enthusiasm for Arabic and the Quran in particular, these two fields of interest came very late in life. Johann Zechendorff was born in 1580 in the Saxon town of Lößnitz in the Erzgebirge. In terms of modern German geography, that's just a few miles north of the Czech border, the eastern part of modern Saxony in Germany. His father, Michael Zechendorff, was himself a school teacher in Lößnitz and then later in nearby Schneeberg, tutored young Zechendorff. In 1599, at the remarkably late age of 19, Zechendorff commenced his studies at a series of Latin schools in Aschersleben, Brunswick, Eisleben, and the Latin school in Zerbst. Zerbst was probably the most exciting Latin school he visited, but he was recalled by his father only after a few months, since the headmaster of the Zerbst Latin school was a crypto-Calvinist. And so to avoid, as Zechendorff's eulogizers later said, to save his son from the venom of Calvinist venom. So I shouldn't say this in Leiden, but I'm just quoting this, obviously. Zechendorff himself was a very pious and Lutheran, so none of this Calvinist venom seems to have stuck to him. Anyway, it seems that it was in Schneeberg, in his early 20s, that Zechendorff made his first significant acquaintance with Oriental languages, studying Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac. Arabic came much later. In 1604, at the age of 24, which again is late for his day, Zechendorff matriculated at the University of Leipzig, and from which he graduated as a Magister Artium 4 years later, in 1608. In 1610, he was appointed the co-rector of Schneeberg's Latin School, where his father had taught, becoming its headmaster in 1614. This was followed in 1617 by an invitation to head Zwickau's Latin School. This was a very nice promotion. Zwickau's Latin School had been in existence since the, I think it's 1490s, and it was a fairly well-known and established Latin school. Zwickau was to, Zechendorff, I beg your pardon, was to remain the headmaster there for the rest of his long life. At his death in 1662, he was survived by his second young wife, though by none of his children. In an age without pension schemes, Zechendorff remained headmaster until his death, though in his final years he no longer attended the school. This, to judge from the apologetic tone of his eulogizer, the superintendent Peisker in 1662, at his funeral service, gave rise to considerable dissatisfaction at this headmaster who wouldn't resign but stayed at home, of course, was incapacitated. After some dealings, Zechendorff was succeeded as headmaster by his former pupil, Christian Daum, himself a prominent 17th century pedagogue. Zechendorff's exceptionally long tenure as headmaster in Zwickau, from 1617 to 1662, seems all in all to have been beneficial to the Latin school, and his scholarly reputation must have stood it in good stead, as well as the fact that some of his pupils, among them Christian Daum, the classical scholar and Arabist Johann Ellichmann, and even Esdras Edzard of Hamburg, were to become respected scholars in their own right. This doesn't mean to say that someone like Edzard was registered as a pupil, but they were visiting scholars. And his reputation in the 1640s, 1630s and 40s was sufficient for people, at least from different parts of Protestant Germany, to spend several months in Zwickau. When Zechendorff took up his post in Zwickau in 1617, he does not seem to have known any Arabic. His first works, extant only in manuscript, deal with the instruction of Latin. Typical of his day is the concern in these works for method, and typical of Zechendorff are the rather peculiar titles: Methodus Kabbalistica and the Kabbalah Nova Antiqua, which overlapped to a great extent. These, again, were never printed and be found now in the Ratsschulbibliothek in Zwickau. Despite appearances, these very dry manuals have nothing to do with Kabbalah, in the normal, at least not in the normal sense of how we would understand it now, but with a stringent method, which, in the spirit of Ramism, clearly defines the bare essentials of the subject at hand, Latin grammar in this case, and its stylistic and its systematic instruction, in the firm belief that this will enable its swift and easy acquisition, schnell und leichtlich, as Zechendorff says repeatedly in his German works. With this, of course, you needn't be a Ramist to be concerned with efficiency and method in the 17th century. Zechendorff actually quotes Ramos several times approvingly, but we may not wish to read too much into that. As we shall see, when Zechendorff came round to immersing himself in Arabic and then teaching it, this question of method would remain a central concern. The same concern for method and quick study of language became evident in Zwickau's undated and unpublished Persian grammar, probably composed in his later years. At least from what I tell from the handwriting, it seems to be something he composed in much later years, extant now only in manuscript. This, again, was never published. That Zechendorff should have embarked on his career in Zwickau with a detailed consideration of method in teaching Latin is hardly surprising. As Alan Ross has recently pointed out, Saxon Latin schools betray a relative stability, quite a remarkable stability, between the late 16th and the early 18th century in terms of what was taught. Most of the dramatic changes in this field in the 17th century concerned rather the how this was taught. Though Oriental languages were taught in several German Latin schools, most Oriental languages, mostly Hebrew, of course, but with occasional instruction in Syriac, Zechendorff's enthusiastic study of Arabic in later years and its instruction in Zwickau seem exceptional. The obvious question, of course, is why? Here, Zechendorff, an otherwise very talkative scholar, is frustratingly reticent. What we do have, in the absence of a smoking gun, is an interesting piece of circumstantial evidence. In 1623, that is 6 years after Zechendorff's appointment, Zwickau's superintendent, Veit Wolfram, by then an elderly gentleman in his 60s, had held a festive speech in the Latin school, published 2 years later in Leipzig under the nice title Nox Cugnea, which means it's Zwickau night. The Cugnea is a nice Latinized verb of Zwickau, the city of the swans, of the three swans. This long and very ornate Latin address is a classic and in itself unoriginal exhortation to the study of Arabic. In it, in 1623, Wolfram told his audience of his recent discovery of this language and his tremendous enthusiasm for it. An enthusiasm grounded mostly on theological grounds, stressing, true to form, its necessity for the conversions of Muslims to Christianity. I would like to add, however, that converting Muslims to Christianity couldn't have been a daily practice of a Zwickau superintendent in the early 17th century. So there's maybe a sincere sentiment, but at least, but it is, of course, a topos as well. Wolfram prides himself on winning over the Latin school's headmaster, Zechendorff, to this new field of study. When the festive oration appeared in print 2 years later, in 1625, Wolfram's address was accompanied by several poems, in Neo-Latin, very florid poems, in his honor. Among them, a laudatory note in Arabic by Zechendorff. The Arabic was produced, and I sadly haven't got an image of that, the Arabic is produced in elegant copper engraving, where he celebrated, he said that he'll always sing his praise and his Mu'allim al-Karim, and he taught him and so on and so forth. But Zechendorff Zechendorff in late humanist hyperbolic promises to sing to sing Wolfram's praise as long as he lives, in Arabic, which looks like a direct translation from the Latin, which he was clearly thinking. "No, my noble teacher, for your instructions, sermones, al-qawla, taught my heart the language of the Arabs." This praise may be rooted in genuine indebtedness. It must be pointed out, however, that a decade later, in the note to his specimen al-Qurani of 1636, Zechendorff claims to have been self-taught. According to the same note, it was in 1626 that he purchased at great cost his own Codex of the Quran. This acquaintance with the Quran, when he was nearing his 60th year, led eventually to Zechendorff's 2 short publications on Quranic chapters, in a sense his visiting card in the Republic of Letters, which draw the attention of Johann Heinrich Hottinger, among others, who wrote him a brief letter congratulating him on doing so well for a German. So he points out it's a lovely backhand compliment. Zechendorff actually reprinted this short compliment. Hottinger actually points out there are, of course, several errors. So if you ever wish to publish this, do contact me. But it's otherwise, for a German, this is a marvelous achievement. Zechendorff was obviously excited about this backhand compliment, since he copied it in his own hand, manuscript, and had it printed in a later edition. So that's the following year. That is 1627, witnessed the appearance of Zechendorff's first work dealing with the Quran, and seemingly in congruence with Wolfram's pious plea for Arabic studies in the service of Christian polemics. A work recited originally at a graduation ceremony at the Latin School in Zwickau on the 13th of August, 1627. And the lovely title, kind of a Ovidian title, is the Fabulae Mohammedicae, it's the Mohammedan fables. It starts with a paraphrase of the Metamorphoses, which I think students would have recognized immediately. The very ambivalence informing Zechendorff's attitude to the Quran is laid out at the outset in his short introduction to this curious work, the Fabulae Mohammedicae. The Quran is likened by Zechendorff to a work of oriental tapestry, striking for both the splendor of its colors and the variegated materials from which it is woven. In less poetical terms, the Quran to Zechendorff's mind is an interwoven medley of truth and falsehoods, dazzling and yet lacking any intellectual acumen or forceful argument with which to move Christian minds. Now, this as well is a well-known argument. There's nothing particularly new in that. A similar argument was, of course, employed as early as 1543 to defend Bibliander's revised publication of Robert of Ketton's 12th century Quran translation. The insult to the Quran, as being feeble-minded and so on and so forth, may have been intended, but it was at the same time an effective argument against authorities who thought the Quran's publication undermined the spiritual welfare of Christian society. In portraying the Quran as a collection of fables, Zechendorff was following what had become a well-established line of argument. Though, and this is the interesting part, I think, though his admiration for the Quran's style and his far-reaching concessions of the evidence of truth, of Christian truths in the Quran, by far surpassed any of his 16th century predecessors. I'll give a short example. While the Fabulae opens with a tread-of-the-mill anti-Muslim invective, nimium stultus populus, and so on and so forth, castigating Muslims for departing from Christian doctrine. And this, of course, conforms to, going back at least to Johann Damascenus, to John of Damascus, the idea of Islam as an outgrowth of Arianism. And the important thing here, I think, isn't so much the insult, but the sense that it's not a completely separate religion. It's closely related to Christianity, not meant as with Judaism. This isn't meant as a compliment, but it's closely, it's in fact isn't a different religion. It's a wrong variation. It's a variation of wrong Christianity. The work's actual content, the Fabulae, points at a more original direction. However, it consists of 10 Quranic fables, that is, Quranic versions of biblical narrations, which Zechendorff first paraphrases beautifully in Latin hexameter, with references to the Quran verses printed in the margins. This is followed then, also in hexameter, by Zechendorff's comments on each of these 10 fables. The important point here is that despite minor discrepancies, none of these Quranic accounts would have struck Zechendorff's audience in the Latin School auditorium as particularly false or pernicious. If anything, they and their eloquent verse paraphrase do more to stress common ground than to excoriate Muhammad's trifles, as they're referred to. In his refutation, Zechendorff points out obvious discrepancies between biblical and Quranic narrations. Without wishing to trivialize these differences, however, they are outshunned by the similarities set out eloquently in Zechendorff's verse. Thus, for instance, the third fable pivots on the Quranic verse 257. God is the patron of the faithful. He leads them from darkness to light. As for the unbelievers, they're patrons of false gods, and lead them from light to darkness. They are the heirs of fire and shall abide in it forever. End of quote. Few of the teachers and pupils gathered in the auditorium in August of 1627 would have found this particularly offensive. This is followed by the Quran's account of the story of Cain and Abel. Even Zechendorff's protest at Muhammad's adding of the raven, of course famously appears in the Quran, unattested in the Old Testament, cannot alter the obvious fact that the Quran's rendering of this episode, eloquently paraphrased by Zechendorff, has much in common with the way 17th century Lutherans would have understood this biblical story. This fascination with parallels and affinities between the Quran and the Bible informed a considerable part of Zechendorff's interest in the Quran, which I won't discuss further here for lack of time, but we could return to the discussion if you wish. Quranic paraphrases of the penitential psalms and a playful address in Latin hexameters on the so-called Quranic fables were clearly part of the intellectual context within which instruction in Arabic in Zwickau took place. They do not, however, tell us much about the actual teaching practices in this Latin school. Zechendorff's scholarly output, short publication, and letters addressed to fellow citizens of the Republic of Letters make clear that as of the mid-1620s, study of Arabic was Zechendorff's main scholarly pedagogical concern. How was Arabic taught in Zwickau? What texts were used and how? And how successful were Zechendorff's Arabic lessons? Regrettably, the honest answer to these questions is that I don't know. In none of his numerous letters, of which I am aware, does he offer even a glimpse of his classroom activity for Arabic or Latin or any subject. Hardly a coincidence, since his correspondence with fellow scholars was devoted to higher concerns, new discoveries, gossip, of course, rather than the practice of everyday teaching. Nor have I been able to find any account by students describing their Arabic studies in Zwickau, which would be marvelous, but I haven't been successful so far. To add to the gloom of uncertainty is a piece of bad news. With the possible exception of private instruction, Arabic studies seem to have disappeared from Zwickau's timetable after Zechendorff's death. A schedule of lessons of 1676, that's 14 years after his death, extant in an uncatalogued manuscript in Zwickau's Ratsschulbibliothek, has no trace of Arabic or of any Oriental language, including Hebrew. I find it unlikely that Hebrew wasn't taught, but it's more likely that Daum, his colleagues, offered Hebrew instruction, at least in the later 1670s, in private lessons. This would seem to be the case. Some solace, but it's not all gloom and doom, some solace is to be found in some circumstantial evidence. The Latin School Library in Zwickau holds several copies of Erpenius's Grammatica Arabica of 1613. One of them bears numerous marginalia in Zechendorff's handwriting, both in Zechendorff's handwriting and then in Daum's handwriting in later years. It is more than likely that Zechendorff would have used this book, inter alia, in both learning and teaching Arabic. Another indirect testimony is offered by Zechendorff's obvious concern to find printed Arabic texts he could read with his pupils. This is a very difficult task in the first half of the 17th century. One such instance is offered by a florid letter in Arabic received from his former Zwickau alumnus, Johann Elichmann, in 1631. Elichmann died when he was 39, but Elichmann later on made a career as a fairly noted Greek scholar and Arabist. It's mostly his Tabula Zebetis, his work on that, which was later posthumously published by Somez. Though Somez distanced himself, was decent enough to publish Elichmann's work, but distanced himself from Elichmann's claim that the Arabic text of the Tabula Zebetis was paramount in trying to edit the Greek text and reconstruct the Greek text. But it would have been interesting, had he lived longer, this interesting line of thought would have been carried further. But anyway, to go back to the letter, in 1631, Elichmann wrote him a letter in Arabic. In 1636, 5 years later, Zechendorff had this letter printed in Leipzig, with a parallel Latin translation, and the Arabic, of course, in Hebrew transliteration. With, and this is already in the cover, it says, with the express intention of using this very florid letter in Arabic lessons, as well as his more conventional Analysis Orationis Dominicae in Lingua Arabica. This is his late work, which he published in 1650. But the mere fact that he'd got this letter translated, or printed, I beg your pardon, shows that he was under pedagogical duress. He needed cheap printed material in Arabic, which he could give to his students. Of greater significance is a collection of copper plate engravings in octavo, printed and elaborated repeatedly in various editions between 1626 and 1648. It's one of Zechendorff's most curious works. The Circuli Conjugationum offer a visible link between Zechendorff's early concern with à la mode method, pedagogical method, and his discovery of Arabic in the 1620s. In a series of complex and beautifully executed tables, Zechendorff offered a visual guide to the conjugation of perfect and imperfect verbs in Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and Arabic. The booklet's production in Zwickau, where no Arabic or Syriac types were available, depended on the skills of the engraver Jeremias Hermann, with whom Zechendorff collaborated on various occasions. The product was a slim pocketbook consisting solely of small engravings, which anyone studying these languages could easily consult at any time to identify a verb's conjugation and tense. As with his earlier Methodus Kabbalistica, we may wonder how easy his Circuli Conjugationum actually were for beginners struggling among Semitic verb conjugation. And as you see, as the title, which you can see here, as the title proudly announces, it was meant to enable the mastery of the verb system in almost all conceivable Oriental languages within the space of a few weeks. But this, of course, too, is a commonplace, and that's, of course, nothing new. What is entertaining, I don't know if this, you can see here, yes, the Tower of Babel, and the president is a bit too small, but you have here Even, stone in Hebrew, and Hajar, Kefa in Syriac and Hebrew, and this is probably Stein, kind of. And then here, of course, he's influenced by the idea of the harmony of Oriental languages. It's more than likely, and it's been speculated, that these works, and I'll show you some of the plates immediately, were directly inspired by Wilhelm Schickard's Rota Hebrea of the earlier 1620s. This is possible, but it doesn't really explain this curious work. I'll show you. The idea I'll just say about Wilhelm Schickard, the idea of Wilhelm Schickard's work, which is in a sense a kind of grammatical calculating machine. You had two discs, two circles with conjugations, just for Hebrew, not Arabic, with vocalization and different conjugations. And by cutting out windows in the second upper disc, you could rotate. It's like a calculating machine. And you can know, according to the conjugation, exactly what the vocalization was meant to be. So it's this wouldn't work. Oh, I beg your pardon. This This wouldn't work with Zechendorff. This is the Hebrew. It's a bit difficult to read, but this is the rather elaborate perfect, and here the perfect in the center, of course, and then the imperfect conjugations. But we have some Arabic as well. The Arabic only came in the later editions. Again, this is something that was reprinted. I must confess, I've spent hours staring at these tables, and they've spent hours staring back at me. And I must confess that I don't really know how they were meant to be used. I'd be grateful for any idea. It couldn't have worked, even if he was inspired by Wilhelm Zwickau's Rota. It just technically wouldn't work in this case. And here you have a beautiful table with... Yes, no, I think that's it. I'm coming to close. I'll just say that, in any case, this slim volume, comprising of ornate engravings, would, in all likelihood, have been far too expensive for most students. And the fact that this work, in all its editions, and at least 4 editions I know of, is extant today only in a handful of exemplars, suggests it was not particularly successful. Zechendorff's appointment in Zwickau in 1617, it must be conceded, does not mark a watershed in the study of Arabic in Europe. In 2017, in 4 years' time, the 400th anniversary of his appointment will sadly be overshadowed by the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, especially in Saxony, so it's not likely to, in all likelihood, would not occasion exhibitions or academic conferences, and there's perhaps no great injustice in that. The case of Zechendorff and Oriental studies in Zwickau's Latin School is nonetheless instructive. Though Zechendorff's scholarly endeavors may have been more heroic than long-lasting, they have something to say about the broader landscape of Oriental studies in the 17th century. For the first half of the 17th century, it may be unwise to draw too clear a divide between centers and peripheries in the burgeoning field of Oriental studies. Having said that, Zwickau was clearly far removed from the cutting edge of Oriental studies of its day. In a sense, this makes it even more interesting. Oriental studies, and Arabic studies in particular, were hardly ubiquitous in Protestant Germany, but certainly more broadly distributed than one might assume. For the Holy Roman Empire, Latin schools are clearly more important for the broader dissemination of Arabic studies, even if not always of the higher standards. Zechendorff was an exceptionally creative autodidact, attentive to the intellectual trends of his day. But numerous other Latin schools in the 17th century, such as Zeitz, Quedlinburg, Weissenfels, and the much better documented Gymnasium Illustre in Hamburg, incidentally also celebrating its 400th anniversary, it was founded in 1613, offered occasional instruction in Arabic. Zechendorff, for all his brilliant peculiarities, was part of a much broader network of scholars, with their eyes set on Leiden, Oxford, and Paris, and their pedagogical concerns and practices deeply rooted in more local concerns. They are an essential part of the history of Arabic studies in early modern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asaph, for this paper on a fascinating figure, as always, with great sense of humor and fantastic material. I think it's really amazing, these kind of sophisticated methods of how to teach. What reminds me, a lot of things you said reminded me a lot of Hottinger. They were not very close friends, but there's a few, I told you, there was a few letters by Zechendorff written in Arabic to Hottinger, to a Calvinist, so his father's kind of cautious not to have been so successful. But also like Hottinger trying to, in his teaching, craft on pre-existing Hebrew knowledge, and then kind of writing these kind of comparative grammars and comparative dictionaries, which I think is, so it's very visible, this kind of also trying to speed up the teaching of these languages by kind of, with the comparative approach. I guess this is really important for these two scholars, and then also obviously for Gerhard, and for the time in general. So and I think also the fact this kind of being at the periphery in a place where, as in Zurich, for example, there were no manuscripts at all, Arabic manuscripts. I don't know, how did he deal with? Was there? I mean, I don't think there was any considerable collection of manuscripts in Zwickau, and.
As far as I know, there's no pre-existing collection. He was fortunate enough to have a network of admiring former students. Most of them professors of Hebrew, but had some interest in Oriental languages. Not primarily Arabic, but Arabic among others. Baldovius is a good example. He was a professor of Hebrew in Leipzig and later a fairly prominent teacher of Hebrew in Helmstedt later in the 17th century. And he actually sent him, he sent him a few manuscripts. I know, and this is tantalizing because I couldn't find the manuscript, in his, Zechendorff corresponded with Gerhard, with Johann Ernst Gerhard, fairly extensively. Gerhard was young enough to be, it was a generation younger, it was about 40 years younger than him, and occasionally he sent him a few Ethiopian manuscripts, which he doesn't, I think there's an Ethiopian New Testament, which is no one here in Zwickau reads, so he sent him to Jena. So all the Arabic manuscripts he had were acquired during his time. He was particularly proud of his Quran. To my great regret, I haven't been able to locate this Quran in Zwickau yet. This is a classical thing for someone to pinch or sell later on. But I haven't. That, of course, would be a great find. I'll just one very important manuscript to him and for his career as a learned publisher of the Quran was the Baidawi. This he came across only in the 1640s, I think it's 1641. And of course his second, I showed you a few pages from the Specimens Suatarum, but in fact the more interesting work came a few years later and this was an attempt to translate and interpret two very short Quranic chapters with the aid of Baidawi. He made a terrible mess of it. It was too difficult a task, but just in itself, just the attempt to explain the Quran on the basis of a Muslim exegete, rather than searching for parallels and discrepancies with Christian text, is itself a pioneering undertaking.
And the Baidawi manuscript ended up in Hottinger's library later.
Oh,
yeah.
Lovely.
No, that was questions, Charles?
How old were the students at this Latin school, and how did it differ from an academy or a sort of university, in fact?
It's difficult to answer because early modern students, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, tend to be much younger. So there's the very clear distinction we would make today is sometimes blurred. University students can be raucous teenagers, 16-year-olds. I can assume, but I say this with no certainty, that most of his students would have been fairly young. But he himself, of course, visited a series of Latin schools when he was 19 and then in his early 20s. So I think, as far as his clientele was concerned, we have to see his permanent students. It would be younger teenagers. Aspiring to a university, Wittenberg or Leipzig would be the two Lutheran Orthodox, probably Leipzig more than Wittenberg in the 1620s, and visiting scholars. Again, someone like Esdras Itzad from Hamburg wouldn't have been a regular pupil, but someone who spent several months in there, profiting presumably from private instruction.
Thank you, Asaph. It's an illuminating example of the need to look at center and periphery in tandem. I mean, both in terms of those who come to study with him privately, which of course there are examples everywhere, but his ambition to belong to an external community, which I think is fascinating and needs further elaboration. A couple of quick questions. The 4 editions of the last work that you mentioned, are there mainly attempts to reuse the same text, i.e. to kind of put in a new title page perhaps, but it's unsold copies, or are there completely new editions? Second, and I'm trying to compare it here with the only school in England in the 17th century that actually taught Arabic, which is Westminster School in the 1650s and 1660s. Schools usually had an annual event which was open to the public, in which the student performed. And I was wondering whether he too used this occasion of showing off the attainment of his students. And of course, Arabic would have been a very exotic thing to do. And in a sense, it kind of elevates his and his school's importance, both in the province and elsewhere. So I was wondering whether there is evidence for this in your case.
I'll start with the second question, if I may. Of course, like universities, and this shows that there's porous a border between universities and Latin schools, at least in the Holy Roman Empire, the Protestant parts of Holy Roman Empire. One characteristic of output, printed output at Latin schools, are occasionally disputations as well. They print disputations. I haven't been able to find any for Zwickau. However, there were, and as to annual events, the obvious annual events would be theatrical production. Even in Protestant Germany, Strasbourg around that time was famous for its, and this would be a marvelous venue to show off this Oriental. Sadly, one of the first things that Zechendorff, during the first years of the 30 Years' War, one of the first things that Zechendorff and the City Council of Zwickau do is do away with the annual theatre. This was reinstated much later, I think towards the end of the 17th century. So lamentably, I haven't been able to find anything. But that, of course, would be valuable if I could get my hands on something like that. But I'm fairly pessimistic. I'm still looking, but I'm fairly pessimistic as to the chances of finding something. As to the editions, here I'm myself a bit embarrassed. It's difficult to answer. There are very, very few editions, now extant exemplars. I've used some early modern bibliographies where they're listed. The only complete, I know there's a complete edition in Hanover, which I haven't seen yet. Wolfenbüttel has one with just a few plates, an early 1920 something. And Zwickau, of course, has two, I think, editions. From what I can tell, it's actually these are genuinely editions in the sense that they're extensions. He adds more tables too. What I haven't shown you, but in this in the 1640s, there's Persian as well, which I believe wasn't there in the earliest. But of course, there's always the doubt that the earlier edition I've seen is incomplete. So.
Questions? If not, I would say thank you very much, Asaph, again for this paper. And thank you. Yeah. And we will meet in an hour back here with our second panel. Thank you very much.